Every single human has abdominal muscles. The reason you can't see yours is because
started to unstick weight loss, and it was started with weight around the belly.
One of the best ab exercises is
This has nothing to do with exercise in the traditional form, and yet 800 to 2,500 calories per day, that's a considerable amount of fat oxidized.
So the fat burner fast is probably my favorite for those people who want to lose weight. The research was done that 36 hours without food, followed by 12 hours of eating, and then another 30. They actually did it over a 30-day period, but we've been using it in our community, just dosing it in. That at 36 hours, what happens is that's enough time where the blood sugars come down, where all of a sudden the body, it's so smart. It goes, okay, blood sugar's not coming. We've been in this fasted state. We've triggered autophagy. We've brought inflammation down. We've made you ketones. We're trying to go find food. But this extra weight, it's not serving you. Because remember, you got to go find food. So it drops weight. And it's the most beautiful way to get a person to unstick any kind of weight loss resistance. And so that's what they showed, is that actually a 36-hour fast started to unstick weight loss, and it was started with weight around the belly.
Abs are one of those 80-20 things, but in this case, it's like 95-5. Every single human has abdominal muscles, except for people that are involved in tragic accidents or something like that. And almost always and almost everywhere, the reason you can't see yours is because your layer of fat on top of them is too much. Abs are made in the kitchen, not the weight room and not on the cardio machine. If you just impose a caloric deficit through moderate activity, good resistance training, you can train your abs or you cannot, it doesn't really matter, and your body fat winnows down to a small amount, you're gonna have whatever kind of abs you have shaped down there. People who have a high level of body fat, who wanna find out how to do some exercise or eat some food that's gonna give them abs. It doesn't exist. It's just the layer of fat that's keeping us from seeing your abs. Training abs works exactly the same way as any other hypertrophy training. 2 to 4 times a week training, multiple sets, close to failure, full range of motion, big stretch, increasing loads and reps over time, the same. The planks, the Supermans, all that bullshit, the twists, it does stuff, but if you want big abs, you just go about it like you would get big calves, big forearms, big shoulders, big anything. Consistent resistance training, that's the way to get it. And then don't just train abs during your fat loss plan. If in a year from now you want thick abs, start training them now. The last 12 weeks of that year, you're gonna diet away the fat, then your abs will be eaten good, they'll get real thick, and then they're gonna reveal themselves as meaty. But if you just train abs during the fat loss phase, they'll grow a little bit because they're new to the shit, but it's not gonna be super impressive. One of the best ab exercises is the ab wheel, the rollout. Isometric work for the abs generally isn't that great. So I would say, if you want that, train abs, train them 2 to 4 times a week, essentially train them right. Don't train them as a special group. But lastly, what I would say is, the effect on how visible your abs are versus your body fat is very small. So you're not gonna see your abs at 22% body fat and give a shit how big they are. Realistically, they just don't get that big. 1, 2, maybe 3% body fat difference. Could there be a visual difference there? Yeah, potentially, but you need years of training your abs to get to that kind of level.
One of the most powerful ways to stimulate epinephrine, which is also called adrenaline, from these neurons that connect to fat and to thereby stimulate more fat mobilization and oxidation is through movement. But I'm not talking about exercise. The type of movement that I'm referring to is extremely subtle, which is that shiver or shivering is a strong stimulus for the release of adrenaline into fat and the increase in fat oxidation and mobilization. But shiver is not just induced by cold, and there are other subtle forms of movement that can greatly increase fat metabolism and fat loss. There was a group in England during the 1960s and 70s that discovered a pathway by which subtle forms of movement can greatly increase fat loss. What they did was they examined people who overate and did not gain weight. And what they observed was that those people engaged in lots of subtle movement throughout the day. In other words, they were fidgeters. And in fact, many people who had low levels of body fat had a lot of resting tremor, not of the Parkinsonian type, but they would bounce their knee while they were sitting. When they would talk, they would engage in very angular movements. They were sort of electric. Fidgeters burn anywhere from 800 to 2,500 calories more than the control group in the experiments that they looked at. And indeed, there's been a modern look into all this, and these numbers check out. It seems to work best in people who are already slightly overweight. So for people that are overweight who are kind of averse to exercise, fidgeting might actually be a good entry point. Fat is controlled by these neurons and the epinephrine they release. You might say, well, how could these little micro movements lead to so much caloric burn? These little fidgety movements, the engagement of certain aspects of our musculature that are nothing like exercise, those low-level movements, they trigger epinephrine release from these neurons, and they stimulate the mobilization of fat. And then that fat is oxidized at higher rates. This has nothing to do with exercise in the traditional form, and yet 800 to 2,500 calories per day, that's a considerable amount of fat oxidized. Now it should make sense why shivering is one of the strongest stimuli that one can incorporate to stimulate fat loss. Now, shivering is almost always associated with cold, and there are two ways that shivering can increase fat loss. And there are several ways that you can use shivering, you can leverage shivering, and you can leverage cold to accelerate fat loss. But you have to do it correctly. The big effects of cold on metabolism and fat burning are going to be through two routes. One is that if you expose yourself to cold, you have the opportunity to trigger activation of brown fat, as well as to convert more beige fat into true brown fat. So you essentially create a stronger or a hotter furnace. That's the way to think about brown fat. It's like a furnace. What you're doing is you're increasing the burn of energy by increasing the intensity of the heat inside you, so to speak. When you get into cold and you shiver, that low-level movement of the muscle triggers the release of a molecule called succinate. And succinate acts on the brown fat to increase brown fat thermogenesis and fat burning overall. It actually increases body heat through this brown fat thermogenesis pathway. And it also, over time, can increase the amount of brown fat by converting beige fat into true brown fat. So first, let's talk about how long to get into that cold environment. Most of you might think, oh, well, if 1 minute is good, 3 minutes is better, and if 3 minutes is better, then 10 minutes is best. But remember, the goal is to get the shiver-induced release of succinate so that succinate can trigger the brown fat. It turns out that if you want to trigger the shiver, what you want to do is to get into the cold and then get out of the cold, and typically not dry off, and then get back into the cold and out of the cold. That will definitely stimulate more shivering than just getting into the cold itself. So what I'm not referring to is getting into the cold environment like an ice bath and waiting until you shiver and staying there shivering. You also don't want to get hypothermic, and I want to be clear, you want to get approval from your doctor before you do any of this. Here's a potential kind of sets, reps protocol that you can play with. Find a temperature that induces shiver for you. That's going to vary depending on your cold tolerance and how cold adapted you are. 1 to 3, maybe 5 times a week. Get in or get under the shower or whatever it is until you start to shiver, genuinely shiver. Then after about a minute or so, get out, spend 1 to 3 minutes out, but don't dry off. Get back in for anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes, but try and access the shiver point again. And you might do 3 repetitions of that. So it's 3 times in and 3 times out total. That's a great starting place. If you become cold adapted, you're not going to get the fat burning effects to the same degree. So cold is a powerful tool for fat loss, but you don't want to adapt. If you're quickly moving from 30 seconds of exposure to 10 minutes of exposure, you're overlooking the opportunity to get the most fat loss and increase in metabolism by stepping it up in smaller increments. Okay? And this also speaks to the rationale for using cold exposure to accelerate fat loss for certain periods, but then maybe not doing it year round. If fat loss is your goal, maybe use it for 2-3 months at a time and then stop for 2-3 months at a time because it is such a potent stimulus, provided you engage in the shiver.